Hello, everybody, and welcome to this Ask the Author session hosted by the International Transport Forum at the OECD. The ITF's Ask the Author series provides quick-fire, 30-minute rundowns of specific transport-related issues. This session is going out live via Zoom and is also being shown on YouTube and LinkedIn. So welcome to you all, wherever you are today. Basically, our Ask the Author sessions work like this. We invite the author or authors of a recently published ITF report to give a brief presentation of the report's main findings and recommendations. Then we invite you, the audience, to pose questions. Today we're going to talk about public transport funding. Well-funded public transport services that provide easy access for all citizens to the opportunities that they seek are essential to decarbonising transport, making our cities more livable and connecting people living in rural areas. But how do we reach this ideal situation? This is the subject of the latest ITF research report, The Future of Public Transport Funding, which you can download from our website. To take us through the complexities of the report, we're joined today by Josephine Macharia, a transportation analyst with the ITF. It's also our great pleasure to have with us the two co-chairs of the ITF working group, Jonathan Sachs and Jean Coldefi, who guided us through a 2-year process which led to the report. In today's webinar, Josephine will take us through the main findings of the report, and then we'll provide you with an opportunity to ask your questions to Josephine, Jonathan, Jean, and myself via the Q&A function. But for now, it's over to you, Josephine.
Thank you. Thanks, David, and thank you for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. This report, The Future of Public Transport Funding, is the result of a 2-year working group on the topic with 40 members representing several ITF countries. And as mentioned by David, the working group was led by Rex Dayton-Smith and co-chaired by Jean Coldefi and Jonathan Sachs, both of who have joined the webinar and will be available for the Q&A. ITF modeling shows that ambitious decarbonization policies could significantly reduce CO2 emissions by 2050 compared to 2019. And in that same time period, passenger transport demand will increase significantly, highlighting a strong role for public transport, combined with active, shared, and micromobility in meeting those reductions in emissions. A well-integrated multimodal transport system with public transport at its core is crucial to meeting decarbonization and accessibility goals. Achieving this will require more investment in public transport. As urban travel demand grows, modal shift becomes more necessary, particularly in urban areas where a majority of vehicle emissions occur. In these contexts, a very low share of emissions relates to trips within city centers where public transport has high mode shares. This means that there's an opportunity for the reduction of vehicle emissions through a significant shift away from car dependency for journeys within outer urban areas, between outer urban areas and suburban areas, and between suburban areas and city centers. This shift requires more investment in public transport to combat decades of underinvestment in many contexts and to lessen the impact of various crises, such as COVID-19 and the energy crisis, on the sustainability of public transport funding sources. This report has 2 main recommendations to enable public transport to play its essential role in a decarbonized, sustainable transport system. Governments must both minimize the funding requirement by focusing on efficiency, and that is efficient service design, efficient construction, and efficient service delivery. And they must ensure that each of the 3 key funding sources we outline in the report contribute optimally through conscious policy design and systematic implementation. First, improving operational efficiency can reduce subsidy requirements and should be an important consideration for public transport service design, construction, and service delivery. What does improving efficiency require? Efficient service design requires developing well-integrated multimodal systems. That means that the right modes are chosen for the right demand conditions and contexts. This also requires developing coordination mechanisms between institutions involved in service planning and delivery. For example, between transport and land use authorities, especially as demographic changes and development patterns might not always match the most efficient options for service provision. Efficient construction requires adopting sound competition principles when developing new infrastructure, making sure that the public funding implications over the life of the investment are considered. And this requires authorities to maintain significant commercial and legal expertise within the public sector to undertake the project specifications and contract negotiations. Efficient service delivery also requires ensuring competition through well-designed and periodically repeated competitive tendering arrangements, and through the systematic use of benchmarking to monitor performance and identify areas for improvement. Fundamentally, competition for the market is better than competition in the market, and transport authorities have a role to play in ensuring well-designed competitive processes that can help achieve potential efficiency gains. Systematically and continuously measuring performance using structured benchmarking tools is necessary to support effective service planning and modal integration. And benchmarking also goes beyond efficiency, looking at other objectives pursued by authorities, and that can require trade-offs. For example, staff productivity may appear to decrease if operators provide additional staff to ensure on-time departures, but the service reliability may increase, which improves the user experience. With this in mind, combining metrics can paint a clear picture of performance, both from the perspective of minimizing costs and from the perspective of maximizing revenue, such that public transport can be more financially sustainable. Beyond improving efficiency to minimize the size of the funding challenge, sustainable public transport requires optimizing funding from three key sources: user fares, government budgets and earmark taxes, and taxes on indirect beneficiaries of accessibility improvements. Fare revenues as a proportion of operating costs are declining in most countries. This necessitates fare policy reforms that maintain equitable accessibility. Fare reform can be politically sensitive, so in optimizing user fares, authorities should publish fare policies that are based on explicit principles. That is, transparent and explicit fare policies that can mean political dynamics have less influence over fares. And fare policies should be integrated into overall transport policy such that they feature clear links between the policy and the strategic role of public transport. Authorities should also establish formal fare setting processes rather than ad hoc changes, and these can include setting targets for revenue to operating costs or establishing inflation-based adjustments. Governments can also consider independent expert advisory bodies for fare setting, which is something that's common in Australia. Authorities should reform fare structures to create efficient incentives. So that one example can be differentiating fares between the peak and off-peak so that demand is smoothed and capacity constrained systems, and they can take advantage of flexible work arrangements that are more and more common. Finally, authorities should adopt well-targeted concession policies because better targeted concession fares can be more equitable, meaning that subsidies are given to those who most need them and are more cost-effective. Next, government budgets and earmark taxes. The urgent need to move to sustainable transport implies governments should carefully review investment commitments currently directed to less sustainable modes. Roads dominate total transport infrastructure investment, so there's an opportunity there to review already committed but unspent funding for major roads projects and redirect it to align with an integrated multimodal transport system and the future funding needs of public transport in that context. One challenge with the reality of competing demands for funding is that it creates uncertainties, potentially slowing the pace needed to meet decarbonization goals, delaying major projects, and increasing long-run costs. Here, there's also an opportunity for efficiency gains by accounting for the negative externalities of private vehicle use, such as congestion. Although politically challenging so far, charges on road and vehicle use, such as congestion charges, can be an important funding stream for sustainable transport. So governments should complement fare policy reforms with reforms to road and vehicle use taxation, ensuring efficient pricing of the external costs of private vehicle use. Governments should also consider earmarking some or all of the additional revenue from new road and vehicle use taxes to improve the availability, stability, and predictability of public transport funding in the medium term. If this revenue can go towards improving sustainable travel alternatives, such charges can be politically and economically justified. And it's worth noting that there are some economic efficiency concerns with earmarking, such as the vulnerability of such revenues to long-term shifts in demand, and these should be minimized with a flexible approach to earmarking policies. Finally, investing in transport infrastructure increases the value of land to residents and businesses by making it more accessible. If this land value uplift is not taxed, it becomes a windfall gain, and in many contexts, measures to tax these gains are ad hoc or inconsistent, and as a result can be ineffective. To maximize land value capture, governments should adopt a clear policy on the use of land value uplift, setting out clear principles and mechanisms. They should take a selective approach, confining the use of land value capture to major public transport infrastructure investments. For example, the Crossrail project in London received nearly 30% of its funding from land value capture, and a specific levy that targeted non-domestic properties contributed to a large share of that funding. Governments should support the integration of transport and land use planning to maximize land value capture. For example, by favoring transit-oriented development, which has the potential to increase land value uplift. In fact, the most notable examples of successful land value capture are in contexts where there's solid control over land use planning and where there's sufficient government capacities and supportive legislative frameworks. For example, in Japan, the Integrated Development Law allows for regional governments to lead the development of land and rail transport, and that model has been attributed to the success of the construction of the Tsukuba line, which is northeast of Tokyo. Finally, governments should design land value capture policies to avoid negative equity impacts while capturing uplift as much as possible. For example, infrastructure levies applied uniformly across taxpayers within a beneficiary group might be argued as to be regressive because uplift might not accrue uniformly across that group. Conversely, other land value capture instruments, such as developer obligations, can be more progressive since they are determined by the market. Governments should keep these principles in mind when considering land value capture policies. Thank you for your time and attention, and I hope you found this content insightful. I will now pass this on to Jonathan Sachs.
Thank you very much, Josephine. So I thought I was just going to say a couple of words of thanks, actually. As David mentioned, it was a 2-year project, and we had 40 excellent kind of panel members or experts who were feeding into it from 19 countries. And yeah, a huge thank you to everyone who did get involved, both providing papers and a lot of material, but also the really kind of fruitful debate and discussion that we had around the table. As people, I'm sure, kind of, well, we'll probably show in the questions, you know, some of the things that we've kind of landed on are debated in the general literature, and we did indeed have the debate at the group, and it was a really fruitful debate. So yeah, huge thank you to everyone who joined the working group and for everyone joining today, of course. But special thanks, of course, to Josephine and Rex for all of their work on the report, as well as just to say as well, it's been a pleasure working with Jean and David, kind of getting it all finalised. So yeah, thank you. And now I think we'll open to questions.
Thanks very much for that, Jonathan. Yes, we're going to go to questions now. And we have a unique situation where we have Jonathan here via video and audio, and we actually have Jean with us, but he's unable to connect to audio and video. But I see that he's actually starting to type an answer to one of the questions in the Q&A section. So we've got multiple ways for you to access the expertise of our co-chairs and Josephine as the ITF expert on this. Could I throw this one perhaps to you, Jonathan? It's a question from Jens. I hope that's correct. Given the risk and cost of tendering processes for both companies and PTAs, I wonder what is your basis for saying that commercially tendered operations are efficient?
So it's a good question. So I think I mean, look, this is again one of those areas that can be debated, right? I mean, a lot of the literature kind of really points towards good management and good kind of objective setting for various things. And I think the tendering process and thinking about the objectives of what you're trying to deliver and being very specific about them is a helpful process in itself. And that obviously, so I think the commercial tendering process kind of focuses you onto that. And if efficiency is one of those, then obviously that is something that you clearly try to aim at. I think, look, a lot of this is about incentives, and there are certainly places where perhaps the incentives aren't in the right place in privately tendered things. But actually, when you look at the literature and you look at the examples and the case studies from around the world, commercially tendered kind of projects do generally deliver higher efficiency. I think the key thing is, though, is when implementing it, is that you have clear objectives, and obviously over time and as situations and context change, that you review and you come back to them, because there are obviously kind of some negatives associated, or at least that have been picked up in some of the examples where perhaps an objective has been kind of focused on too much at the cost of other objectives. So I think it's important to keep reviewing it, but also just make sure that the objectives are clear and that you review those objectives over a period of time to make it work.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. We have a question here from Ella. I might throw this one to you, Josephine, if you don't mind. Could you please explain a bit further who the potential indirect beneficiaries would be?
Sure. Typically, it's everyone within sort of the catchment area of where a major public transport project is being delivered. So that could be the businesses, the residents, commercial enterprises that get better accessibility to their location because of the improvement in public transport access. Okay, great.
That's very quick answer. Thank you very much. Jonathan, I might throw this one to you if you don't mind. Manon asks, how can we involve future users in the design of public transport lines and plans? And how do we define the needs for public transport to invest in the right modes and in the right places and at the right times?
No, this is a very good question, and one that's it's quite a tricky one to answer. And I have to say, I mean, our project was looking at the funding of projects, and I think, and there's obviously some definitely relevant kind of elements that I can draw out. So the first thing to mention is, the point that we wrote in about having integrated plans, I think is a good place to start with. We've certainly pushed towards how do you increase public transport as a share of the modes, because I think we feel that was a kind of crucial part to us delivering our decarbonisation goals. I think if you are going to look at an integrated plan which looks at all modes, you need to do the outreach with communities and with those people who are going to be interacting with the system, and indeed may have to change their behaviours as a result. Particularly if you're introducing road pricing at the cost of cost of potential current drivers, and obviously then changing the public transport offering. I think in terms of actually going out to the communities and talking to them, there have been some really good examples of this. I think we looked at Norway as a particular example where they had done this, and I mean some of this is about talking to the users ahead of you doing it and doing consultations, as many people will do as a standard, but it's also about adjusting and testing things and rolling things out at a pace which kind of people can get used to and can comment on as well and have the opportunity to comment on. Sometimes that's also easier for funding it too, scaling it up in that way. But I think there is a need of a constant kind of feedback mechanism in this process, and I think that's pretty crucial when you come to think about what your plans are, particularly when you're looking cross-modally and you're looking at moving demand between different modes. People need to kind of often experience on the ground what they're seeing rather than just immediately getting onto it. I think the other thing to say is that, and I've kind of said it in my previous answer a little bit, but being very clear about the objectives of your scheme and what you're trying to do about it and what you're trying to do with it and why you're going ahead in that way. I think even though some things you will do won't be popular, I think you need to stick with your objectives. And of course, you need to go out, you need to consult on them. But I think being clear about what you're trying to achieve and how it's going to impact people is really important, particularly if you're thinking about kind of a mechanism where you're road pricing to swap in for public transport. But I think there's kind of a few little kind of bits. I mean, there's a little bit more in the report, and I think that your question is a little bit wider than what we perhaps looked at in the funding context. There's a little bit in the report on that.
Thanks, Jonathan. Josephine, would you like to answer Oscar's question about any recommendations we might have about financing public transport in cities where the transportation system is delivered or managed by the private sector, and in cases where these concessionaries do not receive grants from the government and rely on fees? How do we finance public transport in those situations?
That's a great question, and quite a challenging one, I would imagine. I think from the authorities' perspective, some levers that they might have to make sure that public transport is efficient in those contexts are making sure that their land use planning aligns with what would make this provision of public transport more efficient. So focusing on elements that they have control over, such as compact design, which can allow for shorter trips or more better connections between origins and destinations, can mean that the cost of providing public transport is lower. So I think some of the recommendations we have on improving efficiency would be quite relevant to this idea. And then there's also the idea of competition and ensuring competition in service delivery. That can be an opportunity for authorities in this context to find efficiencies in terms of reducing the cost of the funding challenge, given that they cannot rely on subsidies. I hope that helps.
Thanks very much, Josephine. Excellent. Jonathan, I'm going to turn this one to you, and I'm very happy to see that Jean is very busy in the Q&A section typing replies. We really appreciate that. This is a question from Simon, and it's about how do you make the case to decision makers for divesting from road building and redirecting to public transport. And Simon cites the case of the HS2 cuts in the UK and how funding there was redirected to road schemes. How do we solve that issue, Jonathan?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, I think there's a couple of things. I think, a lot of transport appraisal that's often done in countries uses a fairly static view of what the world looks like now and how we interact with transport now. One of the discussions we had at the working group was around, and we didn't add a huge amount on this, but it was a quite active discussion, was about how you change the appraisal system and what you would need to change in an appraisal system to try and understand the kind of strategic positioning of what you're trying to deliver, and against your objectives. So I think often you need to look at scenarios, essentially. Like you can do demand forecasting based on what's happened historically, but you need to look at scenarios. And I think adding into scenarios, obviously decarbonisation is a factor and different outcomes there that you wish to achieve, along with funding and efficiency and other things. So I think using a scenario-based kind of process definitely helps kind of decide on whether you need to be doing road building or not. I think the thing that we have mentioned in here is, obviously we said you could divert some of the demand, some of the money that's gone to road building into public transport. I mean, by no means I think we're suggesting that all of that should go to public transport, right? Because there is a time and a place for public transport, particularly where you've got plenty of demand and you've got passengers and you've got enough density to be able to support it as a viable option. So I think there's a question as well about being a bit more strategic about how you plan your transport. I certainly know in the UK context that we're perhaps quite modally focused rather than whole system focused. And I think actually, if you really looked at where you wanted to target public transport, say, for example, bringing people in from peripheries of cities into the centres, and then trying to get rid of, cars and private vehicles, in order to reduce congestion, that you obviously focus your efforts there. But I mean, there will be, trips that go outside the metropolitan area and the peri-urban area where actually maybe cars and maybe road investment is justified because they have issues with congestion and things, and decarbonising those journeys by the public vehicle route. So it's definitely not a wholesale kind of you should move it away, but equally you need to consider scenarios in the future and think a little bit differently about how we travel now and about how we'll need to travel later. As we know, private vehicles and electrifying private vehicles will deliver big decarbonisation benefits, but there's a lot built into the life cycle of an electric vehicle. And obviously congestion is still an issue. So those should be really crucial kind of elements to when you're making decisions about it. But yeah, certainly won't be a wholesale shift to away from road investment to public transport, because they don't serve quite the same markets in all cases.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. I think we have time for at least one more question. Let's see how we go. I would like to perhaps give both Josephine and Jonathan and John. I know John is typing an answer to another question right now, but an opportunity to contribute on this one. It's a question from Che Won Gyun. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. One problem that and Che Won Gyun says one problem that we're having difficulty with here in Korea is that we can't find enough sources of revenue to make new projects viable. What are some unusual creative revenue sources that you came across in your research? Who'd like to start us off? Josephine?
Sure. I guess we mostly explored different types of public-private partnerships and alternative financing options for new construction, but the main thing that we came down to in the working group is the importance of making sure that the public authority has the capacity to negotiate and define projects so that they provide the best value for money over their lifetime, and not just considering the benefits of reducing the risk at the start of the project. So I guess it's not necessarily an innovative or creative method, but it's really fundamental to make sure that the lifetime costs of the project are considered when defining the financing needs, and that the public authority is part of that process in making sure that they get the best value from these kinds of alternative financing contracts. And I'll pass it to Jonathan.
Thanks.
Thanks, Josephine. Yeah, completely agree with that. So I think it's an interesting question, because I think we looked at lots of different sources. I mean, there's a good evaluation of a lot of different ways in which you can raise revenue for transport schemes, and they're not all the same. I mean, there's a different kind of mix and different baskets of kind of funding options available for different size schemes and different contexts in terms of where they're set. I mean, I think it's worth mentioning land value capture, because I think that's the one that's often talked about as being this kind of new innovative way of doing things. Of course, it's not new and innovative. They've been doing this for a long time in Japan, and they've seen delivery of new rail services through this approach. And I think what I would say about land value capture is, though it has great potential, I think it is on a very specific set of schemes. These are major schemes that go through highly dense areas. I mean, certainly the Crossrail example that Josephine mentioned in her presentation, is going through hugely densely populated parts of London, very high value parts of London. People, will happy to pay higher rates, and definitely can see the benefits of what they're getting in terms of the transport. So, and as it's around 30% of the total cost has been covered by this. But I think actually, in some of the Japanese examples we looked at the working group, they actually delivered whole capital costs for rail schemes via the kind of land value capture mechanism, but it included developable land outside the railway as well as with the railway itself. So I think there's quite a lot of interesting stuff there, particularly where you've got the density in order to do and kind of deliver that. And I think the one final very quick thing to say is that, in terms of kind of getting private actors involved, I mean, it's obviously vital that you have a revenue stream of some kind, or you have a public guarantee associated with it. So I think there are also methods in which you might want to provide a concession, so the person delivering it gets a concession over a period of time. I mean, we've seen that model been fairly successful across Europe. But yeah, I mean, it's partly about where the risk has been taken on, right, and where there is a risk that can't be covered by the private sector, whether there's a kind of public sector interest in kind of covering it, or whether you can use something longer term way of funding it via some kind of concession approach. But yeah, there should be a few things in there for you to look at.
Thanks very much indeed, Jonathan. Yes, there's a lot in that report, and thank you everybody so much for your questions. I'm going to just launch a very quick poll asking you 2 questions about how you feel about this webinar. We'd very much appreciate your replies. And I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank our 3 panelists today, Josephine, Jonathan, and Jean, for their contributions to the discussion. As you can probably see in the chat, Jean has been answering questions about peak hour pricing, about benchmarking, about the potential of spreading out school start times, methodologies for applying climate funding, earmarking. There's a lot of issues that are bound up in this report, and I'd really encourage you to take the time to read it and the 2 background papers that accompany it. So thank you everybody for your attendance today. I hope that you've learned something new about the funding of public transport. And thank you once again to our attendees, and I hope to see you at our next Ask the Author webinar soon. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.